Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is terror. The horrific terror Israel is witnessing and experiencing, and the Israeli response to that terror. As by now the whole world knows, Palestinian terror ripped through Israel. On Friday night, a Palestinian terrorist murdered 7 Israelis outside their synagogue. The worshippers were gathered to mark the start of the Jewish Sabbath. The synagogue is located in the suburban neighborhood of Jerusalem called Neve Yaakov. The next day, Saturday, the Sabbath day, a father and son were shot and wounded by a 13-year-old terrorist in Jerusalem. They were walking in the city of David, the ancient city of Jerusalem, just below the location of Solomon's temple. The young terrorist, the 13-year-old, was shot by one of his victims and was taken into custody. Immediately after news of the synagogue attack, celebrations began. Fireworks lit up Arab villages and cities, especially in the city of Jenin. In Gaza, there were joyous parades and guns were shot into the air. Hard as it may be for Westerners to imagine, Palestinians were celebrating the murder of innocent Jews. Jews that were congregating outside their synagogue on the Sabbath. The Jewish victims murdered in the attack were a newlywed couple, a 14-year-old boy, a 68-year-old man, a 56-year-old, a 26-year-old, and a 70-year-old Ukrainian Israeli woman. Others were wounded. There were those who call this a cycle of violence. They claim that Israel set the cycle in motion. Earlier in the week, the IDF, together with the Shin Bet, Israel's internal intelligence wing, embarked on an operation in the Palestinian city of Jenin, in the region of Samaria. They were searching to arrest 4 Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, terrorists who, according to their intel, were planning an imminent attack on Israeli civilians. The intel was very specific. The timing was essential. The terror attack was pending. The terrorists were located. They fought. Other terrorists came to their aid. It turned into an all-out mini-battle in Jenin. In the end, 9 terrorists were killed. According to an unofficial source, a bystander, and an elderly Palestinian woman was also killed in the crossfire. When the IDF entered the home after the battle, where the terrorists were staying, bomb sappers discovered 2 live bombs. The IDF photographed the bombs, and then they triggered them to explode, blowing up the house. The live bombs were proof that the attack was imminent. Had the IDF waited even 12 hours, this would be a very different discussion we were having right now. Not about terrorists in Jenin, but about innocent Israelis murdered by 2 terrorist bombs. There is always the worry that an IDF preemptive strike against terrorists may spark a terror response. But that thought must stop. It must not inhibit Israel from preemptively interceding and stopping terrorist bombings before they happen. Terrorist bombings which could kill even more than the 7 victims of the Sabbath night attack. Israel must continue to act and protect Israelis. International law, as well as Jewish law, as well as morality and ethics of war, all approve of preemptive strikes. The logic is simple. A preemptive strike is a classic example of self-defense. The attack against the synagogue was a lone wolf attack. Lone wolf attacks are perpetrated by terrorists who are not part of an organized group. It's very difficult to prevent lone wolf terror attacks. Following the 2 attacks against their citizens, Israel's new security cabinet met. One of the proposals they want to bring to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is to institute the death penalty for terrorists. Until now, Israel has hesitated to take this step. Part of the thinking is that, in a hostage situation, the terrorists will count on staying alive and give in. Adolf Eichmann is the only person ever executed in the history of Israel. Eichmann was the mastermind behind the Nazi plan to murder the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. His experience and expertise was transporting Jews to their factories of death. In order to execute Eichmann, a special exemption to Israeli law had to be passed. In response to the IDF operation in Jenin, Palestinian leadership broke off security interaction and cooperation with Israel. Their announcement was plastered all over the local and international press. Here's the catch. The terrorist cell in Jenin was almost certainly discovered because of the interaction and cooperation with Israel and the Palestinians. But don't think that this is a one-way street. There is no doubt that Israeli cooperation with Palestinian leadership keeps them in position. Without Israel, PA leadership would be ousted in a violent coup. Hamas would have them out and possibly killed in a split second. This causes a problem for Israel. Israel would like a Palestinian partner. The partner they have is corrupt and weak, too weak to control the terror in their midst. The PA is grandstanding and making public statements, like the declaration to break off security interaction with Israel. They are politically and militarily impotent. But they are better than the Hamas alternative. To quote Machiavelli, the enemy you know is better than the enemy you don't. In a few days, or maybe a few weeks, certainly, quietly this time, with no fanfares, security cooperation will resume between Israel and the Palestinians. No announcement, no press release, and everything will return to the status quo. Coming up next, points of view. First up is an editorial from the Jerusalem Post published on January 30th, 2023. Remember, an editorial is the point of view of the editorial board. It's unsigned. The editorial is entitled, "Those Funding Anti-Semitic Palestinian Textbooks Must Be Held Accountable." Editorial. Subtitled, "The rising violence in the West Bank demonstrates that those foreign bodies that fund Palestinian textbooks must demand accountability." This editorial complements the theme we began to examine during the background briefing. The Jerusalem Post editorial board outlines a stark reality that we have known about and about which nothing is being done. The reality is that the Palestinian textbooks foment terror. And the Jerusalem Post argues that those countries that sponsor education in the Palestinian Authority should be held responsible for the lessons glorifying terror that are being taught in Palestinian schools and the terror attacks that are being perpetrated as a result of that which is being taught. This is how they begin. The recent wave of terror attacks reveals the degree to which education and propaganda have led to such a level of hatred that it is the main driver behind the attacks. The attacker who horrifically killed 7 innocent people in the Neve Yaakov on Friday night outside the synagogue was identified as 21-year-old from East Jerusalem. In a second serious attack that shocked the country on the Sabbath, a 13-year-old boy, also from East Jerusalem, shot and wounded 2 people who were walking home from Shabbat services outside the city of David. In both instances, there were widespread celebrations in Palestinian communities in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Fireworks were shot into the sky, and in some places there was shooting into the air, and candy was handed out. Included by the Neve Yaakov terrorist's mother, as the perpetrators of this heinous act were heralded as martyrs and heroes. The editorial speaks of many reports about Palestinian education using terror as a teaching tool. They explain what happens in the PA classroom is no secret at all, that people know what's happening. Certainly the people monitoring know what's happening. The textbooks glorify terrorists, hail mass murderers, and call them martyrs. This is how the Jerusalem Post editorial continues. Every country has educational systems that may celebrate national heroes, but Palestinian education and society at large are unique in how it celebrates those who murder civilians. This is a system that hands out candies when someone murders children and targets people enjoying themselves after a Shabbat meal. The impact of being raised for decades with a worldview of celebrating the killing of civilians, encouraging martyrdom, and pledging allegiance to a race, a state, and people who were their neighbors can't be underestimated. The Jerusalem Post concludes by asking the obvious question. It writes, It's a wonder that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians raised in this system never carry out attacks. But as can be seen from the footage over the weekend, the sentiment that a good Jew is a dead Jew is not a marginal thought in Palestinian society. The rising violence in the West Bank demonstrates that those foreign bodies that fund Palestinian textbooks must demand accountability. Otherwise, there will be many more 13-year-old terrorists opening fire on innocent Israelis. Next up is a column by Ron Ben-Ishai. It was published in Ynet on January 29, 2023, and it's entitled, Jerusalem Terror Attacks Present Netanyahu's Cabinet with its First Test. Now the column, which again continues on the same theme that we've begun with, terror in Israel. This column, as the title indicates, takes a different track. It begins, opinion. The Security Cabinet is made up of militant far-right lawmakers with no tangible experience who may push for an Israeli response that would only fan the flames and lead to more bloodshed. There is practically no doubt the deadly synagogue shooting attack on Friday in East Jerusalem neighborhood of Neve Yaakov was carried out in retaliation for the IDF operation in Jenin a day earlier. The IDF raid against the armed Islamic Jihad militants resulted in the death of 9 of them and was branded a massacre by many on the social media and even some Palestinian officials. Ben-Ishai now offers a prescription for what the IDF must do in order to solve this problem, or at least tamp it down. He writes, meanwhile, forces in Jerusalem and the West Bank have been put on the highest levels of alert. Israel must work to stop further violence from erupting and prevent any retaliatory actions being taken by extremist Jewish groups in the capital or the West Bank. In the long run, such incidents have the potential of increasing the violence that had been curtailed somewhat in the past few months. The force's main mission must be to prevent such a scenario from playing out. Ben-Ishai concludes by writing the following. Washington will probably put pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to avoid any drastic measures. Jordan's King Abdullah II will also likely add his own pressure because he too has interests in maintaining calm in Jerusalem. Now that Netanyahu has established what he calls a, quote, real, unquote, right-wing government, all eyes are on him to see how he deals with this coalition's first real challenge. This is an excellent piece. Thank you very much, Ron Ben-Ishai. He always writes beautiful, wonderful, insightful pieces. We looked at 3 different pieces covering the same themes, the same events, looking at them very differently. The first was my background briefing, the second an editorial from the Jerusalem Post, and now this column from Ron Ben-Ishai. Very different points of view, but very similar in nature. Good to think about. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 7 cartoons today. The first one is of the Ukraine, and we have a picture and an image of David, King David, walking around with a slingshot, and he's on the phone and he says, David here, got your slings, when can we expect the tanks? That's funny. Next up is a line of tanks, and Zelensky says, tanks. US President Joe Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz say in unison, you're welcome, a play on tanks and thanks, of course. Now a cartoon about the price of eggs. How can we not look at a cartoon of eggs and the price of eggs and laugh? It's become fodder for humor everywhere. In this case, an auctioneer at the famous auction house Sotheby's announces the next item up for bid is a dozen eggs. It's sad, but still very, very funny. Continuing along the same line of high prices, a couple is sitting with their financial advisor. He tells them, bad news, if you continue to spend what you can't afford, you run the risk of being elected to Congress. That's hilarious, and actually very, very true in that way. These next 3 cartoons are from Dry Bones, drawn by Yaakov Kirshen from Israel. 2 people are chatting. One says, Iran arrested thousands of protesters. They just executed the first two. And only the size of the international outcry can save the others. The second person says, but there hasn't been an international outcry. To which the first person replies, exactly. Kirshen can be so wise and so witty and so exact. In this next cartoon by Kirshen, in Dry Bones, a person is sitting. He looks pensive and he says, democracy has become a system in which the winners win and the losers say that democracy has died. Kirshen, once again, is correct. And finally, this last Dry Bones points out that what seems to be obvious to all of us, we see a grisly-looking face, and the cartoon reads, inside every enemy of Western civilization is a deep hatred of Israel. Again, correct. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The U.S. Treasury announced that it was placing sanctions on Lebanese money changer Hassan Mukhalid, and because of his financial ties to Hezbollah, which is on the U.S. Treasury terror list. In other words, they are blackballed. Mukhalid was described as a financial advisor to the Iranian-backed Hezbollah, who carried out financial transactions on behalf of the terrorist organization that earned him hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. Obviously, Iran is also on the U.S. Treasury's terror list. So Mukhalid was dealing with two parties on the U.S. terror list, on both sides of his money exchange. The U.S. Treasury believes in squeezing terrorist money sources, and they're very, very exacting. A 17-year-old Israeli was rescued after discovering himself in the middle of a minefield in the Golan Heights. The teenager was guided out of the 55-year-old minefield with the help of the IDF Combat Engineering Corps. The minefield, which was in an area that had been used as a site of the wars between Israel and Syria, was strewn with deadly anti-personnel landmines. Decades after the hostilities had ended, they still remain there. Areas such as this one are all clearly marked, but every year people wander into them. Inevitably, grazing animals get blown up in them when they too wander in, but they can't read. This incident ended with a happy ending, thankfully. UNRWA, the UN agency that delivers basic services to millions of Palestinian refugees, appealed for $1.6 billion in funding. The agency head warned that it was struggling to fulfill its mandate due to the spiraling cost and shrinking resources. Established in 1949, following the first Arab-Israeli War and the creation of the State of Israel, UNRWA provides public services, including schools, primary health care, and humanitarian aid in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. UNRWA released a statement that reads, and I'm quoting here, compounding the challenges over the last year, including underfunding, competing global crises, inflation, disruption of supply chain, geopolitical dynamics, and skyrocketing levels of poverty and unemployment among refugees, have put immense strain on UNRWA. Russia's defense ministry announced that Russia and Syria have restored the Al-Jara military air base in Syria's north. The base will be used jointly by both groups. According to the announcement, which was released on the Telegram messaging app, quote, Russia and Syrian military personnel restored the destroyed Al-Jara airfield. The joint basing of aviation of the Russian Aerospace Forces and the Syrian Air Force at the Al-Jara airfield makes it possible to cover the state border, unquote. In 2017, this small base east of Aleppo was recaptured from the Islamic State fighters by Russia. Miki Zohar, Israel's Minister of Culture, initially announced that the ministry would be slashing funding to all cultural activities that take place on Shabbat. His office sent out a press release indicating that Orthodox Jews will not be discriminated against, and so no money from the ministry will be given to events that take place on the Sabbath. Following a conversation with the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Cultural Minister Zohar, another announcement was made a joint press release walked back the previous statements about all cultural activities on Shabbat being defunded. This release indicated that the initiative for Shabbat day activities will come from the appropriate bodies, not the ministry itself. This now leaves both the funding and the events unaffected. According to the Wall Street Journal, Israel is behind an overnight drone strike on a military industry factory near Iran's central city of Isfahan. The newspaper cited U.S. officials and people familiar with the operation confirming most people's speculation that Israel was indeed responsible. In the course of the strike, 2 of Israel's drones were shot down and recovered by the Iranians. A convoy of 25 trucks was attacked near the eastern Syrian city of Al-Bukamal as it crossed the border with Iraq. News of the attack was reported by the Saudi news network Al Arabiya. According to the report, at least 3 loud blasts shook the area when fighter jets fired warning shots at the convoy. The convoy is linked to pro-Iranian militias. The warning shots allowed the drivers to take cover and escape. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is a Syrian opposition war monitor, aircraft supposedly belonging to the United States were observed in the area of the attack, but this was not confirmed. IDF and U.S. forces have concluded a joint drill. The drill and exercise was billed as the largest joint drill to date between the two countries. Over 6,500 U.S. soldiers and commanders were in participation. The drill also included training and exercises between the Israeli and U.S. air forces, ground forces, and navies. Sources from both the United States and Israel confirmed that this joint drill was a huge success. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Earlier, I described how the United States forces fired warning shots at a convoy carrying weapons to the enemy. The warning shots gave time for the drivers of the trucks to jump out and seek safe refuge. A few minutes later, the trucks with the weapons were blown up. One might ask, why give them warning? Why not just shoot them and kill them together with the weapons or whatever it is that they're hauling and that they are being destroyed together? Why give them warning? The answer is that these truck drivers are not soldiers. They are simply contractors hauling a load with a rig. They're trying to make a living. Like Israel, which sends warning shots before attacking civilian areas, the United States believes that, if at all it can be avoided, these workers should not be killed. This thinking is part of an important philosophy on the morality and the ethics of war. Michael Walzer lays it out best in his spectacular work entitled Just and Unjust Wars. In the IDF, which is actually the abbreviation for Israel Defense Forces, not the Israeli Army, Israel Defense Forces, soldiers are trained in a concept known as Toar Neshek. Toar Neshek means the purity of arms. Weapons are used to protect, and while yes, sometimes they also kill, their purpose is to defend in the IDF. Those in the IDF who violate this principle are severely punished. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.